watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
The Muslim Brotherhood is a pan-Islamic movement founded in 1929 with branches in every Muslim majority and even many Muslim minority countries. It seeks the long-term imposition of Sharia law through an evolutionary process. It normally will use the political machinery, the social, economic, cultural, and political machinery of a country to expand its influence, as opposed to more radical organizations which kill people, terrorist organizations. The Muslim Brotherhood has a similar goal to more radical organizations, but rejects their means. And it's patient, willing to take its time to achieve its objectives. They see a moment of great opportunity right now, and they are working to move into positions of influence, but even they don't want to move too fast. In Egypt, for example, even the Muslim Brotherhood says, we're only going to contest about a third or 40% of the seats in parliament. Why do they say this? They say this because they know that the next few years in Egypt are going to be economically horrific. And they don't want to be blamed for the disaster. They want influence without responsibility. And so if a question is what should we look for, the most important election in Egypt is not what's going to happen in November and December. The most important election in Egypt will be the second round of elections, the next time, the next government. That's the one where it's far more likely that the Islamists may take control of the government of Egypt. The Iranian nuclear program is a strategic decision by Iran. They have been pursuing slowly, methodically, clandestinely, when possible, brashly and boldly at times, this nuclear program. It goes back, the origins go back to the Shah, but the most serious part of it go back more than 20 years. Today, the Iranians have produced enough fissile material, that's the stuff inside a nuclear bomb. They've produced enough to make a nuclear bomb. Now, no country wants to make just one nuclear bomb. It's like no one wants to have just one bullet in the revolver. They don't make successful guns with one bullet in the revolver. Countries want to have arsenals. The bigger the arsenal, the greater the deterrence. The bigger the arsenal, the more blackmail you can impose on your neighbors, the more weight you can throw around. So the Iranians haven't crossed the threshold of actually making a bomb. Their strategy is to build up the supply of the fuel that would go inside lots of bombs. With the passage of time, they come closer and closer to a line after which it is very difficult for anyone, American, Israeli, whoever, to stop them. Are they there yet? No. I'm quite convinced that if they were close to that line, you would see much more assertive action by Americans, Israelis, etc. I cannot imagine an Israeli prime minister not accepting the recommendation from his chief of staff, which would be, yes, we have an option to stop this. Perhaps not a great option, perhaps not an overwhelming option, but we have an option. And I cannot imagine the Israeli prime minister who says, no. Instead, for the rest of time, the people of Israel will live under an Iranian nuclear shadow. So I believe that we will know well before the Iranians get a bomb by action either by Israel or, my preference, by the United States. I say my preference not just because it's an artificial preference, but because the President of the United States and successive presidents of the United States have said so. That we will not deter Iran from using a bomb, as we did with the Soviets, but we will prevent the Iranians from getting a bomb, which is the commitment that we have made on this issue. Do I believe it? On this, I like to believe the President of the United States. And I take comfort in knowing that if for some reason he doesn't, that there are others who will act. If you look at the measures, the steps, the decisions the current government of Israel has taken, but has been reluctant to advertise, has been reluctant even to share with many of its friends, they've done a lot more than people give them credit for, but because of coalition politics in Israel, they're unwilling to take to the pulpit and tell the world this. So, for example, I'll give you an example. Lots of people, myself included, were taken aback by President Obama's statements in May of 2001, offering parameters for the final resolution of the conflict, setting down territorial lines, 67 lines with swaps, etc. My record on this is long. I thought it was, at the very least, this was certainly new policy, and I thought at the time that there were elements in the president's speech that I thought were unwise. All that being said, over the summertime, in order to avert the showdown at the UN, the United States came up with the idea of trying to define a new set of parameters for negotiations and get the Israelis and Palestinians back to the table. His partner in this was the Prime Minister of Israel. And the Prime Minister of Israel very quietly said to the President, if you take everything you said in Washington, what you said in that May 19th speech, and what you said 72 hours later at AIPAC, and you put it together, I sign on the dotted line. I can endorse that. I will endorse it. He didn't advertise this, because the minute an Israeli prime minister advertises an initiative and suggests that it's a good idea, well, then the other side says, well, it can't be very good for me. So he just gave essentially to the Americans his proxy. If you can get that, it's fine with me. The Obama administration tried and failed. It failed mainly because the Europeans refused to buck the Palestinians on certain key issues. The Europeans refused to buck the Palestinians on the question of whether Israel should be recognized as a Jewish state. I mean, what other state is it going to be? Lithuanian? Is it going to be? And the Europeans would not agree to the basic principle that if there's going to be two states, Palestinian refugees should go to the one that's called Palestine and not to the one that's called Israel. And so we have today's problem. But you ask me about if I were the Israeli prime minister, should he perhaps have been more fulsome in his praise 3 months ago? Maybe. It would have saved a lot of headaches in the relationship between Israel and the United States. Would it have been the determining factor to avoid the showdown at the United Nations? No. Israel has excellent relations with lots of countries around the world. In Europe, for example, Israel's closest friends are the countries that used to be part of the Soviet Empire. The Czech Republic, Poland, countries like that. Countries that appreciate what it means to have to fight for freedom. Or to be more precise, countries whose memories of having to fight for freedom are still fresh. Israel has a defense relationship with Germany. It buys submarines from, of all countries, Germany. Israel has a growing relationship with India, an important strategic partner. But all that being said, Israel's relationship with the United States is unique. Why do we have that relationship? Well, there are three basic elements of the relationship between the United States and Israel. First, our shared values. We should not belittle the importance of shared values. Democracy, Judeo-Christian heritage, love of freedom, search for religious liberty. Second, moral responsibility. It would be nice if every other country in the world were animated at least a bit by moral responsibility, but they aren't. And the United States, to its great credit, actually does, to a certain extent, animate its policy by moral responsibility. And what we have done to teach a generation of Americans about the Holocaust is, I think, very important. I'm not talking about Jewish Americans, of course. And then the third element are shared strategic interests. Israel's enemies are our enemies, and Israel is fighting our enemies, and Israel is defending itself against our enemies without our sons and daughters having to fight that fight for it. And so you take all these three elements, and they are the equation that makes this a unique relationship. Oh, I think it made a difference. There are some who say bin Ladenism was dead before bin Laden. And indeed, the poll numbers in a large part of the Muslim societies show that support for what bin Laden represented had already fallen way down, for the very simple reason that bin Laden was authorizing the killing of so many Muslims. The vast majority of people killed by al-Qaeda over the last decade were Muslims, overwhelmingly. Still, there's nothing like actually getting the guy in showing that America fulfills its commitment, that America completes the task, and that in the end, America could invest as much as we invested, as far away as we went, to get the guy. I think that sends a useful message. I wish that America would apply that same message on other aspects with other adversaries and fulfill all of its commitments like that around the globe. we have this concept these days of Europe. We use the term. It's a very artificial term. I spend a lot of time talking to European diplomats and dealing with them in Washington. And believe me, they rarely talk to each other. And there are 27 different countries with 27 different foreign policies. And they were hoping to avoid this showdown at the United Nations for no other reason than they didn't want to have the specter of a Europe divided, because they're going to go in different ways. Europe is now is supposed to have a unified foreign policy. They have a foreign policy chief, Lady Catherine Ashton, like the foreign minister of Europe. But they don't have a single foreign policy. But there are things going on in Europe. It's not your parents' Europe anymore. And it never was, in the sense of Israel. The heyday of support for Israel in Europe was the mid-'60s. It has consistently gone way downhill ever since. I'm talking about Western and Southern Europe, not Eastern Europe. Part of this has to do with the decline of the nation state, where there's this multicultural Europe, rather than a Europe in which Belgians are proud of being Belgian and Dutch are proud of being Dutch. Part of it has to do with the rise of the Muslim communities in Europe. Today in France, for every Jewish Frenchman, there's 10 Muslim Frenchmen. You can do the math when it comes to French politics. There is, of course, a rebound effect that the Jews have nothing to do with, but Jews in some sense are benefiting from, which is that the vast majority of Catholic French are repulsed by some of the more extreme actions of the Muslim community in France. And the Jewish community benefits in a certain way from this. But the enemy of my enemy isn't really a friend in this circumstance. Yesterday I wrote an op-ed that appeared with a colleague that critiqued a New York Times op-ed just last week that was written by two prominent Europeans on why Europe should support the Palestinians. They had given 10 reasons. Every one of those 10 reasons was cockeyed, was wrong, and would make Israel less safe, not more safe. Is Europe totally lost? No, but I fear the day that America loses primacy and we have to share our seat at the table with Europe, which is why I endorse the idea that we need to rebuild our national strength, if for no other, our national economy, if for no other reason that we can retain our position of prominence in the Middle East and do what we need to do to protect our interests and work closely with Israel in that effort. Regrettably, very little, I think, in terms of it being a lasting impact. Look, I think the strategic message to the Palestinians was clear, namely, in any near-term diplomacy, the United States is going to be Israel's ally and not the broker. But I don't think that the chances of diplomacy in the near term are good anyway. So I don't think it'll have much impact. I think on other issues, other Middle East issues, Iran, Syria, Egypt, the president actually said very little yesterday. I was particularly disturbed by the brevity of his comment on Iran. If you look at the speech, and I can go over it with you chapter and verse if you'd like, he had one sentence on Iran, and it was over in the blink of an eye. And this was very, to me, who, I look at the whole range of the Middle East, that was also something which I thought was very noticeable and very worrisome. So I think that the speech was important, and the speech will go down, I think, as powerful, and it'll be viewed along with Daniel Patrick Moynihan talking about the Zionism as racism resolution. It was that powerful a moment in the UN. But I think its actual strategic implications will be short-lived. You know, here, this is another point on which, because of coalition politics in Israel, Netanyahu, the current Israeli government, has been too reluctant to advertise what it has and hasn't done. Let me do a little quiz for you. Does anybody in this room know how many housing units in the West Bank were initiated under the current Israeli government? Give me a round figure. 700? 400? A housing unit, an apartment? 2,000? 0. All right, the number is 2,800. Total number of housing units that were started in the West Bank. Does anybody know the number of housing units that were started under Ehud Olmert, Bibi's predecessor, who governed for about almost exactly the same length? Okay, I'll save you the number. The number is almost exactly twice as much, twice as many, over 5,000. Now, why does Bibi get no credit? Bibi gets no credit, A, because he doesn't tell anybody, because if he tells people that he built so little, his coalition will say, "You built so little, build!" And he gets no credit because if Bibi says the sun rises in the east, people will protest because he's Bibi Netanyahu. Now, is 2,800 too many? Maybe. Maybe it is. Maybe it should have been 0. My own view is that Israeli politics won't sustain 0, which is why under Olmert, you had, who was to the left of Bibi, you had twice as many. I don't think it sustained 0. So could it have been fewer? Sure. Would it have made that much of a difference? I just don't think so. And we have the experience of the settlement freeze to show for it. The settlement freeze, whatever you want to, if you say it wasn't full, it was only partial. The reality is that fewer units were built during the period of the settlement freeze than at any point in the last 30 years. And yet, the Palestinians refused to negotiate for 9.5 months of the 10-month freeze. Do they have their own reasons? Sure. And we can go into them if you'd like. But I don't really think that a declaration on settlements would have changed the calculus very much. We're talking, of course, about Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, who's an ophthalmologist by training, somebody who I like to say is not really a man of vision. Thank you. You're a tough crowd. I think it is highly unlikely that the people of Syria themselves will push Assad out. This is a beleaguered people. This is a people under severe repression. Their children are being taken from them, tortured, and killed. I think it is, if I had to paint a scenario in which Assad is forced from power, it is when the people around Assad and the business community that has made billions from their support of Assad, when they realize that he is more of a drain than an asset. These are not sentimental people. When they realize that they can get a better deal under a different leadership, he will be gone. Now, what will force them to make that decision? Growing international pain, isolation, sanctions, tightening the noose, so that these people pay. And only when they pay enough will they feel the pain enough to do what needs to be done. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.